28 years later is terrifying, but why? Why do we find these sorts of zombies so scary? How did 28 years tap into that fear and create something more horrifying than the zombies that came before it? Well, here's a hint, friends. It tells us more about ourselves than we want to believe. Hello internets, welcome to Film Theory, the show that infects you with knowledge. So I know we're a little bit late to this one, but did you guys see 28 years later? It was a bit of a breakout hit earlier this year, returning us to the world that we first saw in 28 Days Later over 2 decades ago. If you don't know, the 28 blank later franchise is a big deal. That first movie, 28 Days Later, sort of revolutionized how zombies were portrayed in the modern era. You know how zombies can sprint now? How they seem faster and stronger than the humans that they want to eat? That more or less started with 28 Days Later. It also featured a main character waking up from a coma in a hospital to find that the world has seemingly fallen apart before finding another group of survivors to team up with to try to track down his family. You know, the exact same setup that The Walking Dead borrowed. So the franchise coming back with that original creative team was huge. But while I was watching the movie in my theater, I noticed that these zombies weren't exactly what you might expect if you went into the movie blind. And I don't mean because of the very distracting anatomy of the alpha. Now, don't get me wrong, the zombies in the 28 Blank series have always seemed a little bit different than other versions of the undead that we see in media. They're still alive, for one thing, and they were faster than others before it was cool. But 28 years later took that even further, evolving them into new types of zombies, into almost a community of the creatures, and honestly, I thought that was terrifying, which was kind of a bit of a surprise for me. I've been a fan of zombies for years. I was growing up during the big zombie boom in the 2000s. Watching The Walking Dead or playing games like Left 4 Dead and the Zombies mode in Call of Duty World at War with my friends after school. 28 years later was not my first undead rodeo, and yet something about it still hit different, and I want to understand why. So today we're doing something just a little bit different. I want to take a look back at the whole history of zombies and just exactly how they've been used in the media we consume. Stuff like folklore and books and movies and video games, and I want to figure out exactly what about them is scary. What was terrifying about them in the first place that warranted them even being created? And then using that information, I want to see if we can find out why the infected in 28 years later just hit so much more different than other zombies we've seen in recent years. Why were these zombies so terrifying? Well, hold on to your skulls and shield your eyes, loyal theorists. Let's take a bite out of this one. So, zombies as an idea have been around for a long time, even if the word zombie being used to refer to them is somewhat of a newer thing. Undead ghouls or the living dead raised by magic have been around for practically forever, but the idea of the modern zombie can be broken down into 3 distinct eras. The first of these would be their origins in Haitian folklore, which had these undead beings act more like mindless servants controlled by some witch doctor or sorcerer. Rather than being wild or infectious and driven by an appetite for brains, these zombies were more like underlings, drones used by their creators. It wasn't until 1968 when filmmaker George Romero completely reinvented the zombie into something that looks more like what we're used to with his classic film Night of the Living Dead. In this flick, the zombies were transformed into growing swarms of walking corpses, and the only thing they wanted? Human flesh. These were slow-moving, decomposing monsters and were widely called Romero zombies by horror fans since he popularized this interpretation. Fun fact, my mom was into theater for a long time, and she played a zombie in some stage rendition of Night of the Living Dead, and I always think about that, and it's fun. The third era, however, didn't really kick off until 2002 with the release of the classic 28 Days Later. Yeah, this franchise was making waves even with its first entry. 28 Days redefined viral zombies for the new millennium. No longer were these hordes shambling and slow. Nah, dude, they were fast as heck. It's kind of hard to imagine, but before 28 Days Later, the idea of a quick zombie was an oxymoron. Like, that was a stupid idea. Zombies just weren't fast. I mean, just pull out a copy of the 2003 book, The Zombie Survival Guide, and it says that zombies have only ever been slow, and pretty much every book or cartoon or movie or video game released before 28 Days reinforced that idea. But on top of that, another really important thing that 28 Days Later popularized for zombies, well, it was a subtle shift, but it was just how the zombies were actually conceived. They were born from a really, really contagious virus, and we'll get back to that, but that's directly related to how and why we humans find these things so scary. Here, let me explain. Have you ever noticed that there seem to be things that most people are scared of, stuff like snakes, or bugs, or clowns, or the dark. Well, that happened through a process called bioculturalism. That's a big old word that basically means how our biology affects our culture and vice versa. Well, bioculturalism explains why so many of us are scared of those things. Back in the day when our ancestors were hanging out like on the plains or in the jungles, snakes and bugs could easily kill you if you weren't paying attention. Clowns could represent an other, or humans that just weren't part of your tribe and therefore dangerous. The dark could be hiding anything in there, so of course we should be afraid of it. It was all just survival instinct. Well, as we evolved and our societies changed, so did the way those fears got expressed. These days, now those things are mostly in the media we consume, and they use them to great effect. So if you're anything like me, after you saw 28 Years Later, you wanted to do a little prepping just in case the zombie apocalypse hit. So you start looking up some survival gear or bow and arrows, and all of a sudden, bam, everything everywhere on the internet is just all of a sudden covered in ads for this stuff. I mean, cool, but that's just so weird, right? Well, this happens because your data is collected by thousands of companies who then sell it without you knowing or consenting it. And sure, it's one thing if it's just like information about you wanting to get into zombie archery, but it's another when they have your full name, email, home address, phone, and social security numbers. That is not something that should be in their hands. But you have the right to demand that these companies delete your info. But the catch? Doing so is going to take forever if you want to do it yourself. Thankfully, this is where Incogni comes in to take out those data brokers like zombies. Incogni will reach out to these companies for you, do all of the work, and request that these companies scrub your info from their databases. They'll get your info off the market and deal with all of the objections from these shady companies. Plus, with their new custom removal feature in their unlimited plans, you can point to any people search website where your information is visible, and Incogni's agents will take care of it for you. At this point, you probably know Incogni because they're awesome, long-running partners of the channel. I've actually been using them for years in my own personal life. Last time we checked in April, they'd completed 488 takedown requests and saved me over 366 hours. But now we're all the way up to 819 requests and over 529 hours saved. So if you want to keep your personal information private, you can get 60% off an annual plan by going to incogni.com/filmtheory and using the code FILMTHEORY. That's incogni.com/FILMTHEORY, or just click the link in the description and use code FILMTHEORY to get 60% off an annual plan. Thanks again to Incogni for sponsoring this episode, and now let's get back into the zombie apocalypse. The article Monsters Evolve, a Biocultural Approach to Horror Stories, a great name by the way, points out that horror monsters like werewolves, ghosts, and vampires were created as reflections of those deep-seated fears that evolved in our brains. Basically, the human brain was so refined by natural selection to deal with those dangers that horror fiction used those fears as cheat codes to easy scares. It was so universal that cultures from across the entire world who had little to no contact with each other created similar monsters that go bump in the night. For example, variations on the werewolf, well, these were used to warn locals about the dangers of the predators in a local area, and the fear of losing your own humanity like those predators. For a lot of Europe, those were animals like wolves, but in India, where the dominant local predator are tigers, or Africa where leopards, panthers, and lions can be dangerous, they have variations on the werecat. Suddenly, the werehog from Sonic the Hedgehog seems a little less far-fetched, but only a little. But what does bioculture tell us about zombies and why we fear them? Well, Monsters Evolve explains that the idea of infectious zombies triggers the same sort of responses in our brains' ancient circuitry that's usually reserved for recognizing sickness. Which, hey, that makes sense, but in recent years, those parallels have become even more clear. We've touched on it a bit so far, but the zombies in 28 Days weren't actually undead. No, instead they were more like infected living. The source of the zombie plague in this world is a virus that more or less rewires how the zombie brains work. They're still living creatures with fully functioning bodies, and this allowed for quite a few small but important changes to how these zombies could be depicted. The first and most obvious is their speed, and that they were a bit easier to be killed. It was just like killing any other living thing instead of a magical undead monster. But other ways? Well, rather than relying on a bite to become a zombie, this disease was treated more like, well, a disease. It was transmitted through blood and saliva, which means that a bite can infect you, but theoretically, so could a cough. So could a small drop of blood getting into your eye or mouth or open wound. And if they don't have food, eventually these rage zombies would starve to death. So in this way, the zombies introduced in 28 Days were becoming a way more literal metaphor for disease. So with this additional context, when you look back at the types of zombies, you see pretty clear parallels. The old Haitian voodoo zombies are really isolated, almost to one person or family, just like a lot of old sicknesses would have been in the 1900s and earlier. Because people were so separated, it took a lot for those diseases to spread over a wide area. Likewise, as people started gathering up into cities and travel became much safer, easier, and more convenient in the mid-1900s, well, diseases became a bigger threat to all of us as a society, and so did the zombies with the Romero variants. But as the world marched on into the late 20th and 21st centuries, diseases and their places in society changed radically. According to the World Health Organization, in the 21st century, quote, infectious diseases are now spreading geographically much faster than any time in history, end quote. Which, well, we all know that to be true given recent events. But why? Well, it was driven by rapid population growth, urbanization, and an increase in international travel. There are just more people in the world, more people living closer together in cities, and more people traveling the world that can spread diseases that they might have. Diseases that might have been isolated to much smaller areas and died off just a few centuries ago. So, in response to this increased pace of outbreaks, the zombies also evolved alongside the threat they represented. And what could represent a newer disease that spread quicker, that seemed to infect the world overnight? Quick, aggressive zombies that act more like a modern pandemic. A lot of the film and horror industry looked at 28 Days Later and absolutely loved the idea, swiping it for their own, even if it went against their own source material. For example, the 2004 remake of Dawn of the Dead incorporated fast-moving zombies, despite the original's more traditional take. World War Z's hordes of undead were quick and ferocious, despite the book it's based on featuring Romero-like zombies. And Zombieland went as far as to make its very first rule of survival simply cardio, since many of us who are out of shape wouldn't be able to outsprint the undead. That hits a little close to home, but hey, it's not wrong. But the most interesting of these to me has to be the terrible live-action Resident Evil films, because they featured both types of zombies. See, the Resident Evil movie series started before this big shift in zombies, several months before 28 Days Later released. So, while earlier films had the classic slow movers like the original games, later movies played fast and loose with their own continuity to allow for fast and loose zombies to match the trend. It's worth noting that this new incarnation of zombies led to a huge surge in popularity for the monsters. That's not to say that zombies were unpopular back in the day, but after the early 2000s, they were everywhere. I don't know if anyone else remembers just how widespread they were, like from the biggest shows on television, to the biggest games on the market, to more movies than you could keep up with. And beyond the novelty of these zombies being new and different, well, there was a big reason for this surge. According to the paper Between the Living and the Undead, the outbreaks in this zombie media reflected fears of larger epidemics, and in the worst case scenario, a global pandemic. Wonder why anyone would be afraid of that. Anyway, the paper explains that the world has entered a new period unlike anything in human history, and single diseases can reach further, faster than anyone could have previously imagined. That's terrifying, even before recent events. According to Chapman University's annual survey of America's top fears, in 2018, almost 40% of all Americans were fearful of pandemics. And after the COVID-19 basically shut the world down and killed millions of people, that jumped to over 55%. So naturally, creative works started reflecting that very 21st century fear, especially in zombie media where the threat became worldwide. These stories started featuring much wider outbreaks where the entire world was seemingly infected, and the heroes had to find some safe haven left in the ruins of society. These two factors, the new and more dangerous interpretation of zombies from 28 Days Later and the widespread fear of disease, combined, and the rest, as they say, is history. That might also be why so much of modern zombie media really focuses on the how to survive a zombie apocalypse. Like, I don't know about you, but I've had the conversation so many times. What's your plan for the zombie apocalypse? Every one of my friends in high school had some harebrained scheme for survival that almost certainly would have failed, and we weren't the only ones. Obviously, there's the Zombie Survival Guide book, while the film Zombieland is all about the rules of avoiding infection. And ironically enough, most of these were the same sort of things an introvert would do to avoid just normal human contact. And fun fact, even the US government has plans for a zombie apocalypse. The Center for Disease Control once had a section on its website dedicated to the subject, hoping to use it to educate the populace on how to prevent the spread of real disease. And the US military has a manual detailing how to deal with the threat of a zombie apocalypse. Yeah, really, that isn't a joke. It's mostly a tongue-in-cheek document used as a tool for training, but it does tell soldiers to treat a zombie plague like a real disease and contain it as such. And honestly, that's actually a great thing, because horror media actually teaches us how to approach these sort of situations. Or, well, at least their real-world counterparts. According to the book On Monsters and Unnatural natural history of our worst fears, these fictional monsters familiarize us with the dangers of the real world and give us tactics to confront said dangers. That's part of the allure of horror, right? Screaming at the movie screen, telling the idiots up there how to actually survive the situations they're put in. It lets us play out these scenarios in a safe space to refine our own survival skills, and leads us to do fun stuff like the Michael Myers challenge. Like, how hard is it to unlock a freaking door? But okay, all of that is interesting, and it tells us the history of this genre of horror. It explains why we're scared of the undead as a society, even if they've kind of become generic video game enemies a lot of the time. So then, why do the zombies in 28 years later feel so different? What about them has changed to make them truly terrifying again? Because they are legitimately scary. I don't know about you, but that scene where Spike and Jamie were running back across the land bridge at low tide being chased, me and everyone else in the theater were on the edges of our seats. So how did 28 years later recapture this societal fear after we've collectively suffered through the worst pandemic in 100 years? Well, firstly and most obviously, it carries over the same fears from the previous entries in the franchise. Anyone can get infected very easily and very quickly. That has not changed, and the fear has only been compounded by COVID-19. But what has changed? Well, that's the second thing. The infected have changed. We see in 28 years later that they've evolved. There are different variants of them out in the wild. These include the fast ones, which are similar to the original infected, but much more willing to seek out food and water, slow lows, bloated infected that crawl along the ground and seek nourishment there, and of course, the alphas, incredibly powerful infected that seem to be hyped up on steroids. These variants reflect a lot of the concern we had as a society during the pandemic about different strains of the coronavirus evolving, ones that are easier to spread or more dangerous to humans. You might think you're used to one thing, that you have a strategy that works, but then all of a sudden, the rug is pulled out from under you by a zombie and you have to figure out how to adapt to these new variants. But third and most importantly though, the further we get into this movie, the more we start to realize that, well, the infected aren't as different from normal humans as the characters in the movie might want them to be. Those alphas we just mentioned, well, on top of being much stronger than a normal infected, they also don't succumb to rage quite as quickly. They're far more intelligent. They can solve complex problems. They can be patient and restrain their rage if they need to, and they can even use tools. They're natural leaders, commanding the packs of their infected, and are also strategic in how they kill their targets, twisting and ripping their heads off to confirm the kill quickly. But on top of that, they also seem to care for their own, even in small ways. There's a really interesting scene in the movie where several of the human characters stumble upon an infected woman, but she's pregnant and giving birth. One of the humans feels empathy for the infected woman and helps her deliver the baby, a perfectly normal, uninfected child. The mother is then killed by one of the other survivors as the uninfected child is taken by the humans. Time magazine later confirmed that the alpha chasing the humans throughout this movie was the father of this child, and when he sees the dead mother, he stops and regards her almost with a bit of grief, before he then chases the humans that took the child, evidently because he wanted that child back. These infected are becoming their own people, their own species. These zombies are more or less just a different type of human that landed on the different side of the disease, kind of like a lot of our own culture was split over misinformation about the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm sure you remember, but during the height of the disease, bad actors would spread incorrect information about what was and wasn't safe, whether people should or shouldn't wear masks, or even whether or not the disease even existed. It got to the point where I'm sure a lot of people thought it was impossible to understand the people in their community on the other side of those issues. That is the fear that these new zombies in 28 years later are capturing. These people have lives, they care about their own families, and yet we can't help but see them as an other, an enemy that's looking to either infect you or kill you outright. And to me, that is terrifying. That is worth creating horror media over. But also, based on everything we've talked about here so far, it also gives us a safe space to try to figure out how we'd actually approach this, to try to work out how to live alongside people we might originally view as monsters. But in reality, they're way more similar to us than we might think. We just have to stop eating each other alive first. Oh man, we are doomed, aren't we? But hey, that's just a theory. A film theory. And cut! Up next on Film Theory. How can you possibly beat death?